everyone, it is such a pleasure to be with you tonight, and I'm going to give you this fire hose of information. I don't want to detract from our, expertly done agenda. Afterwards, if you have other questions or put them in the chat, we'll try and get to them. And I also have a list of resources, and you can always contact me at the city library, and I will do whatever I can to help you find more information. So hopefully my share will work here, and we'll get going. How does that look for everybody? Does that look okay? Good. Okay, so the East Liberty Park Community Organization, hopefully this will give you some idea of where you live and get you some greater appreciation for truly our amazing area, and it is amazing. So this little slice here I have is from an 1893 Reflex, which is a book of lithographs that are based on photographs that were taken by Charles Savage, who was a very prominent Salt Lake photographer in the 1800s. And this is just a tiny little piece of it because it's the only thing that actually shows our neighborhood that I could find from the 19th century. What you can kind of see here is Liberty Park. Here's going to be 8th. And you can see that even in 1893, we are definitely a rural community. This is as far as it goes. So as I like to say, you're off the map, Jack. Here there be monsters. So to get to the history here, our history in Salt Lake Valley, of course, goes way, way back. Right now, and way back during the time of the pioneers, there really were not Native American tribes living in the valley, but they certainly used the valley just like we do today as a crossroads. But hundreds and hundreds of years before, they did have settlements. And I think it's really fascinating that in the early part of our century, there have been several instances where people have been digging in their yards and have uncovered skeletons. This, as you can see, is at 1131 South, 11th East. The folks had to replace a water main, and as they were digging, they uncovered a skeleton. And of course, the first thing you do when you have a skeleton is you call the police department. And fortunately, the police department discovered that this was not a homicide or a missing person from our century. So when the appropriate people from state history and the medical examiners were called in, it was determined that this individual was most likely a Fremont Native American Indian from about 1,000 years ago. And it's interesting because all of these skeletons that they have been finding around, like in Rose Park and downtown here in our own neighborhood, have all been probably in that Fremont tribe and from about 1,000 years ago. So we go way back. It's an exciting, exciting neighborhood to live in. This right here is this wonderful bird's eye view. This is from, you can see, 1875. This shows the valley. This shows the wonderful grid system that we all love and are so famous for in Salt Lake. The plan for Salt Lake City is so unique because it goes much further back than 1847. Salt Lake City is planned on the city of Joseph, or the city of Zion, as developed by Joseph Smith. This goes by both those names, city of Joseph, city of Zion. And Joseph Smith is the one that laid out the plan, so that when Brigham Young and the pioneers came here in 1847, they already had the place already mapped out in their heads with these fabulous big right angle blocks that lay things out perfectly. And our area here is going to be up in this lovely white broad area clear up here. And that was at the time, and for many decades after the first settlement of Salt Lake City, we live in what is known as the Big Field, or the 5-acre survey. Because what happened is people would come to the valley, and in the early days, especially the first couple decades, they would be given a plot of land closer to the city center. That would be about 1.5 acres. And then they could petition, if they were going to be farmers, to get a 5 to 10 acre plot up here in the 5-acre survey, which is what our area is. And so for many, many, many years, Our neighborhood was sparsely settled, just like you saw in that first picture. And it was basically a very pastoral retreat from the hustle and the bustle of the city. So that's another reason why we're hardly ever on maps. Even the 1889 Sanborn maps, there's only a little slice of 9th and 9th to show the flour mills. But we're not on the rest of the maps because we were outside the city. We were this wonderful rural area. This is another picture. I just love this one because this indicates how we got the names of the wards, which were not just LDS congregations, but they were also those political subdivisions like you'd see like in New Orleans with the wards. This is how the city was organized. And down here in that little corner, we have a little tiny piece of our neighborhood. And interestingly enough, that is the first ward. And how they numbered it, you can see as it snakes around to the west, comes back to the east, snakes around back. And that's how they numbered them. So if you've ever wondered why the first ward is down in our neck of the woods, that's why. And it also helps you kind of see how, again, those wonderful blocks are laid out. You're also being able to start seeing some of these lines through the maps. These are going to be streetcar lines. At this point, they're drawn by mules and also the canal system, which we'll talk a little about too.
Cherie, can I interrupt just for one quick second?
Sure.
The viewers have asked if you might be able to put it on display mode, which I think when we did our test run, you hit that little button.
Oh, you know, I did, and I completely forgot about that. Thank you. Is that better?
I'm not sure. That looks better on my screen, but everyone's screen might be a little different. Thumbs up if that looks better. It looks bigger.
Does it better?
Great. Okay,
Great.
that works.
Oh,
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I knew I was forgetting a button somewhere. Thank you. So now we're going to talk about the water system because water is at everybody's forefront thought right now. Salt Lake has always had a problem with water. We are a high mountain desert climate. It's like the hardest climate ever. But the valley was also blessed with, we know, our 7 creeks and springs throughout the area, especially up here in the 5-acre survey. And so right after the pioneers came here, within days, they started diverting City Creek and starting to use the irrigation water. And after several decades, Brigham Young said, we've got to get some organized water here. Well, by that time, the farmers up in our neck of the woods had all the water rights. And so the city got together and they had a plan where they would have contracts with exchanges of water from the creek water, and then started to use water clear down from Utah Lake that was pumped up into this system called the Salt Lake and Jordan Canal. Now, very few of us, but some of us do, and I know in our neighborhood still have water rights. Yay! And that water does still come up from Utah Lake. You don't drink it, you use it to water your stuff. Don't drink that water. As this all was happening, the city was also then laying pipes with this Salt Lake Jordan Canal to bring that water through the valleys. And I love this picture because this is our neighborhood. We were a little later than the rest of the city because, again, we're out in the sticks. This is 11th East. These are wood mills on either side. And this shows you the wonderful wood slat pipes that our original water used to run through. All through the area, you have these fabulous big wood stave pipes, which would later be replaced by iron. But we were able to cover up the Jordan River Canal and have these wonderful pipes because, you know, people kept falling in the canals and drowning because they were significant. So this was another huge civil process. It actually started in the 1870s, downtown area. It was finished in the 1880s. We get ours a little bit later. Water, always a big issue in Salt Lake, but managed amazingly well from the very, very first. This map here begins to show you how things are starting to be subdivided. And I love this map too, because it has some really early subdivisions that will be broken up later on. I live in what is known as the Lincoln Park, because I do live on Lincoln. And it also shows that there are a couple different types of tracks you are going to encounter in our neighborhood. Some of them are actual train tracks, narrow gauge, that actually went up to Fort Douglas, and some of them are streetcars, because we have a fascinating history with streetcars. Now, as people moved into the 5-acre survey in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, land speculation just went bananas. And people were selling off their farms in order to gather that money and move out, move to different places in the whole territory. And these subdivisions start getting named. Sometimes they're named for the people who lived in the area or had been part of the area. Sometimes they're named, like Parkview is an obvious one. The Gilmers, or the Gilmer family, they lived there. The Young is the LeGrand Young. And this area right here will become Garden Park Ward on his estate. Inglewood is more of a, lovely pastoral name, like Windsor. Windsor was used a lot in lots and lots of places, Windsor Place, Windsor Park. And Woodmansee, which was a question I had early on, was named for the Woodmansee family. They lived there. And for those people who are familiar with some hymns, Emily Woodmansee is the one who wrote As Sisters in Zion. So we have that kind of connection, and that's where the Woodmansee comes from. The streetcar system is fascinating because Salt Lake, sometimes gets a bad rap, sometimes outside of our own little community. Salt Lake has always been progressive, always been at the top of things. We were one of the first 5 cities in the world to have central electricity. We had electricity in 1888. After London, New York, San Francisco, and Cleveland, we had electricity. And right after electricity, they changed those mules that ran streetcars into electric streetcars. This is actually a very early one. This is like from the 1900s. I love that car. But by the 1820s, streetcars were the way to go. About half of all adults in this area rode streetcars. And there was one that ran right down 9th East, ran down 11th East. The tracks were everywhere. You can see how the grid was just full of streetcars. And it was a fascinating history with our streetcars. But in this even amazing heyday, they finally started declining in the late 1830s. By 1941, the last streetcar made its trip, and they had been all replaced by that time by electric buses, or by gas buses. So for a while, it was just an amazing setup, but the tracks were there and the wires over the streets were really kind of almost a pollution among themselves. But the streetcars were amazing. This kind of gives you, again, some more idea of the various subdivisions we had. I've talked about, I think, most of them. Some of these are about the people who lived there or worked there. And then the street names are tricky when you're trying to do history in Salt Lake, because prior to 1916, some of our major arteries in our neck of the woods were different names, because again, we were the rural place. So after 8th South, as people moved further this direction, instead of our 10-acre blocks, which is what our grid is based on, the blocks were even bigger. And so after 1916, they shortened the blocks and they had to rename the streets. And when you look at some of the maps in the 1900s, you can see there are lots of names that just don't exist anymore. And even streets like Sherlock, that's a street that was completely gobbled up by the Smith's parking lot. So I had a question too about why we're called Sugar House. This is one of my favorite stories because I have lived here my whole life. The Sugar House is named after the sugar factory. Even though this picture is a later date, it shows the wonderful light streets, it shows the power poles, shows the tracks. The building was still there. The building was designed by Truman O. Angell, who was the architect for the Salt Lake Temple. And it was begun in 1854, so soon after the Saints arrived here, because Brigham Young wanted the city to be totally self-sufficient. And one of the hardest things was getting sugar. And they discovered that in France, people were making sugar out of sugar beets. So they got a lot of sugar beet seeds. They sent for a sugar factory, literally shipped here. It took 52 oxen teams to bring the equipment here. They put the whole thing together. They got a good quality molasses out of it for a year. And then after that, the poor thing just could not survive. It just never, ever made good quality sugar. And they closed it down as a sugar factory. But that is the name that stuck as more people began to move to this rural area. I love her name, Ma Smoot, Margaret Smoot. She was the wife of the local head there, really, of the area, and he was the bishop of the Sugar House ward. She said, let's call it Sugar House, because that made sense. This building right here, if you don't know this, and I should have said that, this is right on the corner of Highland Drive, 11th East, and 21st South. It's where the Barnes & Noble is. So this is where the Sugar House was, right at the Barnes & Noble area. They used the factory for a paper mill. They used it for a button factory and a machine shop and lots and lots and lots of other. They never let it go to waste until it was finally torn down in 1928. My favorite story about the paper mill is that in the newspaper, especially the Deseret News, there would always be this crying need for rags, because rags were so needed to make the paper. And they just never seemed to get enough rags to make their paper. And so a remark began to circulate and become quite famous that the citizens of Salt Lake would rather wear their rags than read them. So we're going to talk about some old buildings to start out with. This is the earliest one I can find, our oldest commercial building. And it's actually in the back of what is now the Barbacoa on 9th and 9th. And it is the Leffler building. It started out as a flour mill in 1878. And that part of the building is still standing. Then a little while later, the flour mill was sold to a couple other hands. The Woodman building was built onto the front of it. And this building has seen tons of different types of businesses. A steam carpet cleaning. It's been several grocery stores and retail spaces. Now, of course, it's a restaurant and there are apartments up there. I'm so glad that they have taken such a beautiful job of maintaining this beautiful building, because it's our oldest as far as a commercial building. When you talk about buildings in the area, you have to talk about churches, because those are probably the most prominent, other than homes, in our area at this time period. And these are some wards that have disappeared. Either their buildings have disappeared, or actually the congregation has been moved other places and the name has been lost entirely. And the reason that that's important is because it shows that the demographics changing so significantly in our area. The first ward in our area would have been the Emerson ward. And this was built in 1905. It was destroyed by fire in 1916. It was just an electrical fire. And the next one right over here to its right, that's what replaced it. And this particular rendition of Emerson Ward was later remodeled even further in the 50s. And then this building was completely torn down. And in kind of a reverse of what generally happens when buildings are torn down, houses were built instead. Instead of tearing down the houses to build another building, this actually got houses in it. But the cool thing is you see the flagpole. The flagpole is still there. The house is on Emerson, and you can go see the flagpole. It's pretty cool. This next ward next to it is the BRYAN ward. This is the ward I actually grew up in. This is a fabulous old Art Deco building. It was built entirely by the citizens of this area. They had to scrounge. The bricks inside were secondhand bricks. It was built during the Depression. It's this beautiful Art Deco rendition. It actually shows up in a lot of architecture books because it was unique. And it was very, very loved because the people had to pay for it and build it themselves. This building was torn down to build the Sugar House Steak Center, which we'll talk about. So that land was preserved, and it's still, that land's there today. This beautiful ward here is the LeGrand ward, named for LeGrand Young, but not from his property. And that building no longer stands, but it has been replaced by a new building, which we'll show you in a minute, and that's going to be the 31st ward. And this lovely building here fortunately has new life. This was the 31st ward and at times the 36th ward. It was then purchased and is used for the realms of inquiry as a school. And now it is the Ignacio de Cristo Church, which is a Filipino Christian church. So it adds a little layer of greater diversity in our area. And we're really glad that that building is still standing. Some other buildings that have come and gone. This building I remember from my childhood. This is the Bethel Baptist Church, and this sits where the University Pet Clinic is right now. But it served a wide congregation and was very, very active in the community and very active trying to turn its local Mormon members to, they felt, what was the light. There was a mission attached to it. But this is the Bethel Church, and it's just charming. I love this building. It looks like something out of like Tombstone or something. This is the St. John's Chapel. It's an Episcopal church, and you may recognize it. It's now an adorable yellow private residence there on 9th East, which I think is just an amazing ability. It just is such a cute building. This really lovely building is the Liberty Park Methodist Episcopal Church. It was torn down, but fortunately was replaced by that congregation. And then now it is the Life in Christ Christian Reformed Church. They were all very connected, this particular church building with its congregation. And so you can kind of see where that is. And that's on the corner of 8th and 9th. And we'll show you the building that has replaced it. This is the building that replaces it right there. And I feel bad I didn't take the other shot of the back because it has this beautiful stained glass window. It's a lovely, lovely building in our community. This is what was the Salt Lake Sugar House Steak building. And it housed the BRYAN ward, the EMERSON ward. It housed the Sugar House ward, which actually has its own building, which is now where they're attending. But this building has also held several other congregations. Currently now it is home to the Pioneer and the Liberty Third wards. Those are both Tongan wards. The thing that's exciting about our area is we have had a lot of ethnic wards call our buildings in our neighborhood home. The old Emerson ward had a Samoan ward. And this ward, this building here also housed the Swahili branch, which was huge. It was an amazing congregation of refugees from all over Africa, speaking all different kinds of African dialects. It was an amazing and charming congregation. And that's moved to another part of our valley. This is, of course, the Garden Park ward. And I have to tell you, do you know how hard it is to find a picture of this ward that doesn't have brides in it and the backyard? Very few pictures of the actual ward, but of the gardens, which are exquisite. If you have never seen the Garden Park ward, you need to go and visit the gardens. They are what's left of the estate of LeGrand Young, and it's exquisite. This here is the Emerson ward, which at one time had been the Hawthorne, Marlborough, and Roosevelt wards. When I was a kid, we used to think it was hilarious that a ward was named after a cigarette. Not really, but Marlborough was one of our congregation areas. And then this one here is coming back, total first circle. This is the 31st ward and the first ward. So now you know where the first ward comes from. It was from the very edge of the map. And now we get to claim the first ward again as ours. Now, another big, huge part is also, of course, going to be schools. And while we have lots of the edges of our area that will go to schools outside our area, I'm going to talk about the 3 buildings that are actually in our neighborhood. And the first, of course, is Emerson School. And actually, Emerson Ward is actually named after the school, not Ralph Waldo Emerson, because the school was so critical to this neighborhood. This is one of the very first big schools built in the state. And at one time, it was said it was the largest elementary school west of the Mississippi. It starts out in 1894. And at about the late 1890s, 23 school teachers and their families moved to our area to get their children away from the corrupting influence of Salt Lake City. And of course, being school teachers, they had to have a school. And so they built this beautiful little brick school. And within just years, it had to be expanded. And they call this the train because you can see how it keeps adding and adding, like adding on train cars. This is the school I grew up in. This is the one I know. And it is a charming, wonderful school and very much a part of the community. This is what it looks like today. Its claim to fame is the architect for the building was also the architect for Symphony Hall, Bravenel Hall. But I have to tell you, I really prefer the old one. And this wonderful building here was called the Emerson Annex, attached economically and culturally with the Emerson School. This is up on 13th South. And this school was an orphanage. And then later on, it became the Villa Nursing Home, then Hillside Rehab Center. And now the place where it stands now is the amazing In-Between, which is our hospice for homeless people. The In-Between is a tremendous resource and such a fabulous blessing to so many people's lives. And it's such a delight to have it in our neighborhood. But I love this building because it shows why this area in this building was called the Villa. For people who've been around this area long enough, when they tore this down and built the building that currently the In-Between is in, and it was Hillside Rehab Center, everybody in the neighborhood always called it the Villa. And people would say, why on earth are you calling that the Villa? Well, because at one time, this is what it looked like. And so it was a big part of our neighborhood. And today, it's an even more important resource to help citizens in our neighborhood. The junior high was Roosevelt Junior High. And that now has a second life, which is wonderful. It is the Roland Hall St. Mark's Middle School. They have fabulous programs there, and it's exciting to see that this 100-year-old building has this great life. And I put this picture here just because I love this picture. This is taken from the 50s in Roosevelt, and it's sort of like, wow, water, what an invention. And of course, the high schools always have a massive influence on the area. This is our East Side High. This is such a fascinating history because we always think of West as being the oldest high school. East kind of can almost claim that because what happened was there was Salt Lake City High. It had to be divided into West and East. West got their building first. But East building was done in 1914. I love the picture of the dancers and I love the mud. You can see the streetcar and then this little 1915, the little tiny little jalopy here trying to make its way through the mud. And I love comparing the dancers. There's of course our High School Musical dancers. That's kind of our big movie claim to fame, High School Musical. And just so you know, if your kids have ever seen High School Musical, Sharpay's lockers are still there and they're still pink. Now, this is the fire station. This is such an important, and I have to apologize to Jason. I thought it was 1911. It's even earlier, 1907. And look at the cute horse. This was a significant moment in the neighborhood, 1907, because for us, that's pretty early. But that says we are a real community. We have a fire station. And that was a big thing. And it sits right there where our fire station sits today. Now, I had a great question about the golf course. There was a golf course, and it was the genesis of the Salt Lake Country Club. This was on the grounds of the Gilmore Park area, the Gilmore family estate, and they leased this land to the city to establish a golf course with the clubhouse. A Spalding traveling salesman said, oh yeah, this course is going to be as good as anything back east. I'm sure he just wanted to sell his merchandise, because it was a terrible golf course. It was a whole, half 2 blocks away from the streetcar line because it started on 11th East, the streetcar's at 9th at this time. It's rocky, it's hilly. I can't even imagine why someone would build a golf course on a slope like that. It was a terrible course, but it lasted for 5 years, and it gave people the impetus to then build Forest Dale, which of course now is part of Sugar House as well. But yeah, this was the Gilmer Golf Course and the beginning of the Country Club. Now I have a question too about the zoo, and I can talk forever about the zoo, but I'll make this really fast. This is the wonderful Liberty Park Zoo. And one of my favorite things in the world is Princess Alice. The Liberty Park Zoo started out in 1911 when they received a few deer that they put on exhibit. It was such a hit that the park decided, wow, we should have more animals. And so they just kind of went up in the hills and collected native animals, things like mallard ducks and quail and a fox, skunk, some more deer, but it was hugely popular. And then a traveling circus came through with a really interesting temperamental elephant. And they offered to sell the elephant, and the children of the city collected pennies and nickels for a $3,000 elephant, which was, I think, amazing. It was Princess Alice. She's named after Teddy Roosevelt's daughter, Alice. If you know anything about Alice, Princess Alice the elephant and Alice Roosevelt, similar personalities. The one tragedy, and I have to say this because it's really sad, but you have to know the truth. Truth is important. They did breed Alice. She did have a wonderful, adorable calf. She accidentally rolled on him and killed him, and she mourned for days. But Alice is so intelligent. At one time, her trainer was removed. She went on a hunger strike for 10 days until he was reinstated. The problem with Alice is she liked to roam, and she would kick out her restraining walls on her enclosure, and she would run up and down the neighborhood. And when she did that, this was back in 1916, 17, 1920s, early 1930s, she would often take along with her the clotheslines and the laundry that she was picking up as a little festoon around her neck. She would, of course, trample people's gardens, their vegetable patches. The neighbors really got tired of Alice. And at that point, the wonderful Hogle family said, we really want to keep Alice. We don't want to get rid of her or lose her. We're going to give you this wonderful piece of property up Immigration. And that's where Hogle Zoo comes from. And that's where Alice then goes to. So our one remnant of Alice at the zoo, if you go to the reptile house, that fabulous carving over the door, that is an actual portrait of Alice. The sculptor sculpted Alice's face. This is one of the mystery buildings I just love. I just think it's fascinating. It's there on 8th East and just north of 8th South. This is the Highland Exchange building. This is where your telephone calls went through. And lately, in the 50s, it was bought by the church. It was used as the storehouse, a shoe factory, and also the soap factory warehouse. Now it's going to be condos. It is a beautiful building, but I love this building because it shows how forward thinking the phone company was. This is one of the few libraries that they put into an actual business. And so this is actually a city library in just this business, just for the ladies who work the switchboards. They also had a garden roof. I mean, this is like working for Pixar back in the 1920s. It was just forward thinking and amazing. And so I think that is one of our great buildings. I'm so glad it's being preserved. Just across the street from that building is this beautiful garden courtyard. It is so well preserved in our city. We're so lucky to have something so beautifully preserved. Just a wonderful little neighborhood. We have 3 parks in our neighborhood. We have Englewood Park, named after that subdivision Englewood. We have the Herman Franks Park, which is named after the great baseball player from East High and also manager. He played for the Dodgers when they were dem bums back in Brooklyn. He coached and managed the Giants, and I don't know if it was so great to say he managed the Cubs, but huge man in baseball. So our baseball field there on the corner of 7th and 13th, that's named for him. And then we have this lovely little park named for Beatrice Evans. Her family is very well connected. Her family built this in her honor, and it's just a charming park right there in the middle of Gilmer. We've had some famous people live here. One of the most, probably seriously, the most famous person to have lived in our neighborhood is Russell M. Nelson. He lived on 13th East and about 940 South. Also, Joseph Fielding Smith, who was also president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We had a couple other general authorities. You can see that list. And we also had a governor, Herbert Maw. We had Elizabeth Pugsley Hayward, who it just fascinates me. She's an amazing woman, because you'll notice that she was elected to the House of Representatives and as a state senator. And always remember, she's elected and serving in these positions before the 1920 amendment that gave all women the right to vote. Utah is just a fascinating, fabulous place. Probably the most famous person, though, really is FAIRBANKS. FAIRBANKS grew up for a little time, just a short time, on Sherman, just above 8th East. And she, of course, is the love of King Kong's life. No one did it better than Faye. This wonderful house that my sisters and I used to call the Munster House, it housed the fabulous studio for the FAIRBANKS family, and they are amazing. And why you say the FAIRBANKS family should have impact, it's because there's something that AVARD FAIRBANKS did that will be part of history forever, and that is he came up with the concept of the ram for the Dodge vehicle. Originally, he made a radiator cap head for the Plymouth in 1931. It's called the Flying Lady. Actually, it's a mermaid, but it's beautiful. AVARD then was called by the company and said, you know, we've got 10,000 cars coming out with this name Dodge. We need a symbol. He brought his books, he brought his clay, and he said, how about a ram? And they said, why a ram? And he said, well, if you see a ram coming down the path, you dodge. And they loved it. And so Dodge Ram is due to AVARD FAIRBANKS. He also did the big leopard that's in East High, and he also did the mountain lions up by the Hogle Zoo. And I love this house, and that's just why I put it in there. It's one of our earliest houses, and it's so beautifully kept, and it's there on 17th South. Now, we talked about the Perkins edition as a subdivision. This is a really cool thing. The Perkins edition was this massive project to build these massive, beautiful houses in the Victorian eclectic style. They're all a little different. And the reason they're important is that this is the first big incursion of a Gentile or non-LDS neighborhood. And it's built around a streetcar. And streetcar suburbs are important throughout the nation because it shows that development and why transportation was important. There are at least 10 of these houses still standing, and they are beautiful. They're all a little different, and it really impacts how our southern eastern part of our neighborhood has grown and developed because of the streetcar. And they would have built more of them, but it's felt that the 1893 Depression really curtailed this project. But if we're going to talk about houses, we got to talk about the Joe Vincent Chateau. This is the house up on Yale. This is incredible. And it's kind of like it almost feels like a mafioso story, but it's not really. Joe Vincent started out in 1916 with a saloon. In a few years, he's selling soda and offering billiards. And the next thing you know, he's got a fabulous cafe that's everybody's favorite. And in 1926, just 10 years after his saloon, he's able to build this chateau. But he's had some dark times in his life. When he lived on, I think, 12th East, he had a little girl, 12 years old, 2 years old. She died horribly from a scalding water accident. And at his Joe Vincent's cafe, he had a woman fall through the ceiling as she was waiting for her boyfriend. That did her damage. And he also had an employee lose a finger on a meat cutter. And then he himself was arrested because apparently he had gambling going on in his establishment. He himself dies a fiery death at an automobile crash in 1936 in Colorado. They bring him home. He has his funeral in the LeGrand ward, and all the luminaries speak, and even the chief of police is one of his pallbearers. So he was a really colorful character to go along with his house. Now we're going to finish up really fast with 9th and 9th, which is such an amazing area because it really shows the eclectic, fabulous nature of our area. Jason asked me how many gas stations were around. In actual 9th and 9th, there were always just two, one where the dry cleaners is and one where the vessel is now. But interestingly enough, back in the 1870s, rather than gas stations, it was flour mills, because there were 3 flour mills at 9th and 9th in the 1880s. But going along with the gas station theme, even though there were 2 at 9th and 9th, at 9th and 11th, just 2 blocks up, there were 3 gas stations. So 5 gas stations in a 2 block radius is a lot. But that was because in 1950s, we were motoring. There's a wonderful urban legend that Starbucks threw in the towel and could not beat Coffee Garden. Starbucks actually offered to buy Coffee Garden. They said no. And Coffee Garden hung in there strong, and Starbucks left. Now, Starbucks' story is they left because they wanted a drive-up feature that was not possible in our neighborhood. And that's the story they're sticking with. But the Coffee Garden is a cherished and loved spot here in our neighborhood. The tower is so fabulous. This is what it actually looked like. That's why it's called the tower. You see that in 1927 is when it was built. It got talkies right away. It had the first air conditioning in any movie theater in town. They changed the facade in 1950. I don't know why. I loved this one. And it is currently the oldest continually moving theater. So the tower has changed a lot. Now, as an art house film, it kind of really fits the vibe of 9th and 9th. The vibe of 9th and 9th has a lot to do with this place, Cosmic Aeroplane. As you'll see from the Polk directory, it is a psychedelic shop. In the 60s, it actually truly was a head shop. That's where you got your various equipment. And it didn't last in 9th and 9th too long before it moved closer into town, but it really kind of set the stage for the vibe of 9th and 9th. We have some amazing things on 9th and 9th, like our fabulous 9 Muses by Troy Pillar. I just love these muses. I think they're fabulous. And my favorite, of course, is Clio, which is the history muse. We have some other great features of art in our area as well. LENKA did these amazing pieces of artwork that are now on the McClelland Trail, which goes over the Jordan and Salt Lake Canal. You can take that walk. It's a walking place. It's a place for biking. It goes along the McClelland and up along 12th East, goes up to Milton. Eventually, it'll go all the way out through the rest of the valley. And her big sculptures represent the tools and the gears that actually work the Salt Lake and Jordan River or Jordan Canal. She's also got some artwork out in front of the county health department, so you can recognize her work. And then looking to the future, we will get out of the blue this wonderful breaching whale, which I think just adds another dimension of uniqueness to our neighborhood. And I took like 10 minutes too long. Here are my resources. If you have any questions, please let me know later on and I can hopefully answer them. Or if there's something I don't know, I will find it out. So thank you.
Wow, what a treasure, Cherie. Really appreciate the time you took to put this together. Learned a lot, and I appreciate you also sharing your PowerPoint presentation with us. We'll be able to put that up on the ELPCO Facebook page in our next newsletter so that folks can go back and maybe look a little closer at some of the maps and kind of see some of the details. But wow, really cool. Learned a lot, and thank you for taking all this time. And what